Hello, everyone.
Hey there, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to today's show. We're delighted to have Laura Schleifer back with us today. Laura's, I think this is the fourth episode in a series that Laura has kindly presented to us. And Laura's a US-based co-founder and organizer at Plant the Land Team Gaza and the Total Liberation Campaign at the Institute for Critical Animal Studies in North America. In previous episodes, Laura has guided us through some of the historical, religious, scientific, and philosophical events that have helped shape our attitudes towards other animals and the creation of a stark animal/human divide. This divide, as well as our concepts of animality, have informed our oppression of other animals and humans. In this this could be the final part of the series, but we'll see. We'll be exploring the role that the animal liberation movement can play in transforming our understanding of other animals, reframing human nature and animality, and shaping political ideology towards total liberation of human and non-human animals. And as ever, please do feel free to put your comments in the chat and make your contributions known. Like before, Laura has done a great job of interacting with the comments and as well as presenting the material. So we'll hope to carry on with that.
We certainly will. So, yeah. Hi, everyone's in there already. Let me see if I can see a few. Well, Veg met Codbod now. What a surprise! First, Jeremy second. Hi, Deb. Now look at this, everyone. So if you're suffering, you're not going to be suffering this much, I wouldn't think. So, so well done. You're probably lying on a block of ice, I would think. Deb. So, hello to Dave, Michael, Bernie V, Amber, Louisa. Hi. Just scrolling down a little bit here.
The academic. Hello.
Bernie Brannick. Hello from Dublin 3. Over there. Hi, Terry. I think I've covered everybody. Did I miss anybody, folks?
Twisted.
Twisted, yes. You missed Twisted.
Twisted Sister.
Twisted Sister. I was thinking that.
Twisted Sister. Now. So welcome back, Laura. It's been a long time. So, and I know you've had a pretty stressful time, really, haven't you, in the last few weeks? So, in terms of all of that, do you want to give us a quick kind of thing about what the situation is right now and all that?
In Gaza.
Yeah. Yes, and also you can tell a little about the Plant the Team Land.
Yes. So it has been, a very extremely stressful situation. So basically all of this started because, there's never a time when, Israel is not inflicting violence in some way against the Palestinians, but specifically this recent explosion, metaphorically and literally, of violence it started with them trying to evict some Palestinians out of an ancient Palestinian neighborhood of Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah. And because of that, Hamas, which is the government in Gaza, sent some rockets to retaliate, and then Israel started bombing the hell out of Gaza in response. And so that really is what led to the whole horrifying situation that was going there. That was so horrendous that actually even the Israeli media, Haaretz newspaper, reported that the Israeli military was intentionally targeting and wiping out entire Palestinian families in Gaza. So absolutely horrific situation. Plant the Land Team is a humanitarian aid organization that is basically founded and run by Gazans in Gaza. And I work with them, and they do vegan food justice, and they also do all kinds of other community support. At the moment, the really big issue is rebuilding houses because a lot of people lost their homes. So we did an emergency fundraiser for that, and we got a ton of support. And we also got a $5,000 grant from Million Dollar Vegan. And they are really trying to do a lot of food justice work now. And so they're donating 3,500 meals to Gaza. So the only other issue that we're dealing with at the moment is that on top of everything else, Israel has put this blockade on Gaza, where they make it very difficult, if not impossible, to get aid into Gaza. And so we have been struggling with that a bit, but it looks like we are going to be able to get the aid in very soon. And so we'll be able to continue with that as soon as possible.
Oh, good. Do you think,
amazing.
did the leadership, the prime movers of Million Dollar Vegan change? Did they get new people, different people in?
I don't know, but it does seem like it, because it seems like their focus has massively shifted from trying to convince these big public figures to go vegan, much more to actually directly helping crisis situations and with vegan food aid. So, like, for example, I know that along with Gaza, the other part of the world that they recently helped was India because of the COVID crisis there, and they donated a lot of vegan food aid there too. So I definitely think they're going in a much more positive direction than they were before.
Incredibly welcome shift. I mean, if anybody in the chat knows this, because obviously famously their first idea was to give $1 million to the Pope to go plant-based for about a month, and then $1 million to Donald Trump for the same reason.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a switch.
Yeah.
Knows about that.
I'm not going to lie, I was pretty shocked when they contacted us. I was like, Donald Trump to Gaza. Wow. Talk about an extreme 180, but, I'm not going to knock it. I mean, I'm really happy about it.
Well, at least they didn't send Donald Trump to Gaza for a month anyway, so that's...
They don't need that kind of help, quote unquote. That'd be one time when the blockade would actually be a good thing to keep in.
So, the human-animal divide, Laura. Take it away.
Okay, so I'm going to be giving a very brief overview of the other 3 sessions, and then we're going to delve into the final, hopefully, chapter of this never-ending saga of the entire history of the Western world and its attitudes about animals and animal nature and humans and human nature. Big topic, but let's try and get through this today. All right, so basically, the human-animal divide was something that, we would like to send him somewhere, but not Gaza. I am right there with you on that one.
Yeah, talk about they've suffered enough, or what?
Yeah. So basically it started out prehistoric times. There was no divide, right? The divide is a construct. It's something humans came up with over time to separate and distinguish themselves from the rest of the animal species. But originally we were just another species of mammal, primate, what have you. That started to change with the advent of agriculture, and humans did start to see themselves as being different from other animals because they were producing food in a way that other animals were not. And of course, they were also starting to dominate and control other animals in a way that other animals were not doing to each other or to them. So as time went on, you start to see this separation happening, right? You see ancient Egypt. I included a picture of the Sphinx because that was kind of in the midst of that process of starting to think of the human form of the god. And then we get to ancient Greece, and we get to the Judeo-Christian Bible, and there's this increasing attitude of God is in human form, humans were modeled after God, humans are separate and distinct from other species of animals, and humans should have dominion over the animals, right? We're pretty familiar with this, I think, in the Western animal rights movement, this idea of dominionism. Obviously, there was even a movie called that, right? And, another one who kind of contributed to that idea was Aristotle, with his great chain of being, that there was this sort of hierarchy of species, with humans, of course, at the top, plants at the bottom, then insects, then birds, and amphibians, and reptiles, and then mammals, and then humans, and then gods and angels. But the bottom line was that this was always justified through religion. And so there really wasn't a lot of questioning of it, because it was like, well, God made it that way. You're not going to question that. It's faith. And so for thousands of years, that really was a very stable, if oppressive, system. And of course, it also served to kind of justify this whole idea of God said that was supposed to be the king too. And God said there was supposed to be this hierarchy of class. So, all of this kind of served to stop anyone from questioning any of that.
Laura, before you go on, I have a question.
Uh-huh.
I was thinking that back in ancient Egypt and Greece, you have all these legends of gods taking the form of animals. Mm-hmm. Or in Egypt, you have gods that are half human, half animals. Mm-hmm. And that would normally translate into they don't think that animals are lesser because their gods would not be represented as animals.
Right.
Isn't it a bit controversial?
I think that there is definitely some truth to that. If you're considering your gods to take the form of animals, other animals, I should say, that is going to affect, I think, how you see other animals here on Earth. Whereas if you have this image of God in your head, first of all, as one person versus many, and then, of that being a human, and then of that being, let's say, a man, and then let's say of the, appearing to be white. I mean, all of this is like layers and layers of influence of how you will see your fellow humans and your fellow animals. So, yeah, I do think that there is some truth to that, personally. So we can continue.
Yes, please.
So the big change really starts happening in the Renaissance, but really kind of moving into the Enlightenment, so-called Enlightenment, really, in many ways. But basically, there's this big sort of move away from justifying things or through religion and understanding the world through religion. And there's this big move towards, we need to find a new way of understanding the world. Religion isn't really working out for us so well for a variety of reasons. And so Europeans start turning to science as a way of understanding the world and why it works the way that it does. And so one of the big questions here, which has kind of haunted them really even since the biblical times, is this question again of what, if anything, separates us from other animals? Are we separate and special and unique and, deserve to have dominion over the others? And so they think, well, we'll find out through science. We'll justify this through science. And so they start actually doing experiments on other animals. And what do they find? They find out that actually there really isn't anything that they can quite pinpoint that makes humans clearly different. And they have a big freak out over this because suddenly they can't use God. What are they going to say makes the difference? And I should mention that this is actually really where a lot of our theories that we use and the modern contemporary animal rights movement come from this period, because actually the Enlightenment era philosophers and scientists, they were saying, wow, what are our moral responsibilities to other animals, if anything, because of this realization. So at first, they're kind of open and receptive to that, but then they start trying to, again, find a way to rationalize separating themselves and putting humans above other animals. And of course, part of that was because, well, we all know humans want to exploit other animals in a myriad of ways. But also, the other reason why had a lot to do with colonialism and actually their attitudes about the humans that they were colonizing. So I think we can move to the next slide.
Bit of a delay between computers sometimes.
Oh, okay. So they started trying to come up with, what are the defining traits of a human versus a quote unquote animal. And so according to this construct they came up with, humans are rational, they have the ability to reason, they're self-controlled physically and emotionally, they walk upright, they have good posture, they're modest and well-mannered, of course, questioned by whose standards. They have morals and ethics. Again, by whose standards? Big question. Create and use technology. Access power through rules and laws, not brute strength. They have written and spoken language. They're future-oriented, conscious of time, and of course their lives are worth more than those of quote-unquote animals. Now, basically, they came up with this list of traits, and then they kind of measured the colonized people. So these were people that they were looking to steal their lands, steal their resources, enslave them, and this provided a very convenient way to justify all of that by imposing these traits onto them, and thus quote-unquote animalizing them, framing them as being more animal-like. And of course, there was also a lot of, they didn't understand the cultures of other people from around the world, and they were constantly measuring them against this European standard as the quote-unquote human. So this really was kind of where this divide started to really take place. We can move ahead.
I'll tell you one thing, Laura, that they obviously came up with number 1, 2, and 4 before social media, if that's me.
Yeah, I think that would have been quite challenging for them to put in that binary. And then, according to the construct, animals are, so these are the traits they associated with animality, ruled by instinct, quote unquote savage, no morals or ethics or manners, irrational, emotional, no self-control, can't control their urges, unable to see the future, just kind of living for the moment, illiterate, unable to communicate verbally, hunched over, bad posture, walking on all fours, immodest. Again, all of this is very subjective. You have to keep asking yourself by whose standards. Lacking technology, accessing power through brute or physical strength, and of course, their lives, according to this construct, were worth less than quote-unquote humans. And so it's very important to kind of note all of this, because this is really how the ideas that undergird a lot of very oppressive ways about thinking about different types of humans, or different groups of humans, come from. It was really kind of imposed on them through these traits that they had kind of constructed as animal-like traits. Not that they actually necessarily saw those traits in those groups of people, but that they kind of project them onto them and then rationalized enslaving and exploiting and stealing their lands, etc., through that. So we can continue. Okay, so horrible, horrible scientific racism came out of this, trying again to rationalize that binary and codify it through science. So horrible period of history in many ways with that. And we can continue. Okay, then we get to a new way of thinking about this new era, which is the influence of Darwinism. And a new sort of ideology comes up. This is going to be very important for what takes place after that, including our own time, which is called determinism. And this idea of determinism is that there really is no such thing as free will. It's, if you think of the phrase, I can't help it, it's in my nature, that really sums up this idea of determinism, that you were born a certain way and that's how you're going to be. And any attempt to try and fight that or resist that is just hypocrisy and lying to yourself. So what's interesting about this is that, of course, the Europeans who created this binary between themselves and the so-called animal were horrified at first to realize that they too had descended from apes, were a type of ape. They were appalled by this. But then they actually learned to, or decided to, embrace their own animality. And I'm actually going to pose a question. I'm going to see if anybody has any thoughts. Why do you think Europeans would in the end maybe want to embrace their own animality? Can anybody have any thoughts on that?
Maybe because it could allow them to do all kinds of crimes and justify them as part of our nature.
Yeah, allow them to do all kinds of crimes, right? And I'm going to ask another question relating to this, which is, we know how this human-animal binary affected the people who were animalized under it. But I'm going to ask, how do you think it affected the people that were supposedly human?
Like preservation of the species or something.
Preservation of the species. But in terms of how they felt about, so think about it, if the traits of animal are no self-control and the traits of human are self-controlled, if the trait of animal is no sense of time, live for the moment, and the trait of human is very conscious of time, if the trait of the animal is immodest and the trait of the human is modesty, can you think of how it might affect the people who were classified as human, how they would feel about that?
I guess it makes people feel. Oh, sorry, Tom. I guess it gives you that. It gives people that sense of almost being superior in some way if you have these qualities that are considered human compared to the qualities that are considered animalistic. So therefore people are going to adopt more these qualities and really shun the qualities that they view as animalistic, including in humans. And they're going to, anyone who has those qualities in the human world that they consider animalistic, they're going to again use that as a justification for oppression and discrimination.
So you're 100% right that it definitely gave them, and still gives them in many ways, an attitude of superiority. But I'm going to ask, can you think of any downside for them to be, quote unquote, the human, to be in that role of that binary?
Would it mean that they might suppress or think that if they behave like an animal, then they feel ashamed for that? So it kind of creates more distance as well in that sense. Yeah,
suppression is a big word, right? If you have to be the human all the time in that equation, then think about it, right? The human always has to plan for the future. The human has to always have self-control. The human has to always, there's like layers and layers and layers of rigidity. And if you look at European society during that period, you'll see the rigidity. I think like in the previous episode, I was talking about even the fashion starts to reflect that, right? Becomes more and more constricting and more controlling. And it was stifling. It was suffocating for them. And so, at first they were just so scandalized by Darwin's discovery because it did destroy that attitude of superiority that you were talking about, Wendy. But at the same time, after they mulled it over, they started to think to themselves, maybe there is something actually a little bit appealing about this idea. Maybe I want to embrace my inner animal. I can't help it. It's in my nature. And that allowed them to cut loose in that way. Now, of course, this was not Europeans across the board, because the really poor Europeans and the disabled Europeans and, the oppressed Europeans, they didn't see it that way. Obviously, this was weaponized against them. But for the ruling class Europeans, and especially the ruling class European men, there was something appealing there about this. They could unleash their libidinal forces, as they say, and not have to feel like, and feel justified in doing so.
Do you think there's an element, Laura, that when people say, often, some non-vegans would say things like, we're top of the food chain, circle of life, we've got incisors, that the mentality behind that links to what you're saying?
100%. 100%, yes.
Also, there's a little bit of cherry picking that goes on, because people will justify certain behaviors and say, but it's natural. This is our nature. This is, instinctive, and you see it out in the natural world. So therefore we're justified in doing. And in other ways, people very much remove themselves from those animalistic behaviors and say, oh, but we're better than other animals. We're superior. So it's kind of like people see it in both ways and cherry pick the bits that suit them to suit their own purposes.
Yeah, absolutely. When it suits them, then they're the human and the others are the animals. And then when it suits them, it's, well, we're all animals. It's just that we're at the top of the food chain. We're the apex predator animals. So yeah, they're playing with both of these ideas to reap the benefits of both. Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, we can continue. So take a look at a few ways that this manifests still today, right? We talk a lot more in the animal rights movement, I find, about the animalization of marginalized and oppressed people. But I want to talk about the ways in which the powerful animalize themselves. So we'll take a look at Shark Tank, right? This is such a perfect example. You've got these billionaire investors. They think of themselves as sharks. They're circling around prey, sniffing for the best deal. They're all swarming. And, there's also something where there's a metaphor in capitalism about sharks and minnows, right? And there are only a few sharks and there's a million minnows out there. So only the true predators can ascend the class system in capitalism, and the minnows are all out there as prey. And of course, that's the common people, right? The wolf of Wall Street. Notice again, the predator, the apex predator in the capitalist system. Then we have Jordan Peterson, aka Lobster Man, major figurehead of the alt-right. I know he doesn't consider himself to be alt-right, but many on the alt-right love him. And justifying, well, humans are naturally hierarchical. We're meant to be hierarchical, just like other species. For example, lobsters, right? All animals are meant to be hierarchical. This is just our nature. And then this one's not suitable for work, but I had to include it. Trent Reznor from 9 Inch Nails. I want to beep you like an animal. I think that really sums up, again, this idea of, embrace your inner animal, cut loose, be wild. This is the side to animality that those in power will actually tap into to justify all the horrible things that they do as well. Okay, so we can move on. Okay, so I'm kind of contrasting here between determinism and humanism. Now, interesting thing about humanism is that that is actually the ideology that came out of the Enlightenment. And it's a very paradoxical thing because on the one hand, you'll see these Enlightenment thinkers and they talk a lot about rights. And so, in humanism, there's a lot of, you'll know it's humanism because you'll hear a lot of talk about rights, right? I've got some pictures here, the gay rights movement, the National Equal Rights Amendment March. You'll see a lot of stuff about LGBT rights or human rights. This is from the civil rights movement, equal opportunity, human dignity, right? So anytime you see this sort of like centering of the human and this concept of human rights, that is humanism. But it's horribly ironic because, of course, these same philosophers who talked about human rights and liberty and egalitarianism and, et cetera, democracy, also were the same ones that were promoting these very racist ideas. And of course, they were able to do that because of this human-animal divide that they really in many ways had constructed. So humanism kind of sets up this tension where, oh yeah, you get all these human rights, but only if you are passing as a human according to the dominant system. So we can continue.
Don't you have an opposition to the status quo then, though? I mean, I'm thinking the French Revolution, for example. Isn't this whole thing doubted and challenged?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the revolutions of that period very much came out of that. The French Revolution, the American Revolution, the English Revolution, these are very often called bourgeois revolutions because especially the American and English revolutions, but even to a certain extent, the French Revolution, these were not revolutions that overthrew that way of thinking. It very much was contained within that way of thinking, which was really very oppressive in its own right. And of course, that's why there were not human rights for everyone. Okay, so I think we skipped something here, but that's okay. I will just give a little explanation. So basically, what happened was that after Darwin, really determinism started really taking over humanism in a big way. And that happened through social Darwinism, and then that happened through the eugenics movement, which of course I talked about in the previous episode, and it really ultimately culminated in Nazism and the Holocaust. And, this was this whole process of the embracing of animality by those in power, and this idea of we don't even need to make a pretense anymore of there being this conception of human rights. It's all BS. It's all a hypocritical lie. We embrace our savage, brute, animal nature. And I want to say one other thing before we move on, which is that really a lot of this developed actually in the regions that the Europeans were colonizing, because they were out there in the jungle, as they would put it themselves, and their, civilized Europeans, quote unquote, were back home. They didn't know what was going on in the quote unquote jungle. And the Europeans, they started to really kind of enjoy that freedom to be the brute savages, which is horrifying, but this is really what happened. So this, just became more and more and more out of control. And after World War II, the West was mortified and they said, oh my God, determinism was a terrible idea. We need to go back to humanism. And so humanism, again, became really kind of the dominant ideology of that post-war period. However, lurking in the shadows, there was a new determinist influence that was developing. And the new determinist influence was something that we hear a lot about today because we're still living under this system, and it is called neoliberalism. So we can continue. So what is neoliberalism? A lot of people are really confused about this. And basically what it is it's an economic movement that came out of the post-war period, and it really emerged out of a crisis in the old liberalism. And when I say the old liberalism, I mean the economic liberalism, which basically was laissez-faire capitalism, right? This idea of don't have the government get involved, just kind of let the corporations do what they want. And of course, that ended up leading to terrible labor rights violations, right? We all know about that period, the children in the factories and, all kinds of terrible things. And then eventually it ended up leading to the Great Depression, and in many ways played a major role in the two world wars. And so because of that, the dominant powers that be were saying, that wasn't such a great idea. We probably should regulate capitalism. We don't want to get rid of capitalism. We don't want to go like the Soviets and become communist. But we really need to regulate capitalism more because it's unsafe. It's dangerous to let it run free. The neoliberals were like, oh, that's a terrible idea. You don't want to regulate capitalism. That's going to lead to socialism and communism. We need to let capitalism run free. And of course, you hear this word free, right? Free trade, free market. Let capitalism run galloping free. So they said, well, what are we going to do to stop there being a problem like there was from the old economic system? And they thought, well, it's not that we should put regulations on capitalism. Au contraire, we should do the opposite. We should, number one, deregulate everything in sight and let capitalism do its thing. But on top of that, we should get the government to actively help capitalism. So rather than government hands off, it's government hands off when it comes to things like public services or public protections, but government hands on when it comes to helping the capitalists. So it was actually even worse in some ways than the original capitalism, the liberalism, in the sense that it not only offered no protection for the public, but it actively had the government helping the corporations. So we can continue.
One interesting thing about laissez-faire capitalism, of course, is that it's all built around this myth of the free market. But from a vegan point of view, there was never a free market when it came to farming. That was never left a chance.
Yeah. So that's yes, and of course that's a perfect example. The subsidies are a perfect example of exactly what I'm talking about, right? The government actively helping the capitalists. So not just hands off, but actively helping the capitalists with our money, without our consent.
And in the name of hands off as well. So it's kind of a double bluff.
Right.
Yeah.
So here we have the founder of neoliberalism, Friedrich Hayek. And what's very interesting is that Friedrich Hayek was born in 1899 in Vienna, Austria. And actually he came from a family of very prominent natural scientists. His father was a botanist. His uncle also taught the natural sciences and was a prominent writer on those subjects. And Friedrich Hayek himself was very interested in biology, zoology, botany, etc. as he was growing up, and he would help his father and grandfather with those fields. And I'm going to ask, does anybody here have any thoughts on what the influence might have been in Austria at the turn of the 20th century in the natural sciences of botany, zoology, etc. So we're talking early, like turn of the 20th century, the natural sciences, everybody was talking about this thing. It was a big thing in the early 20th century. Zoology.
Deb is, in the comments, Deb said eugenics.
Eugenics came out of this thing. Yes. So this is what led to eugenics. But of course, the thing that everybody was all abuzz about was...
It could be positivism.
Cultivism?
Positivism, yeah.
Oh, positivism. Yeah. Definitely related to that.
Is it to do with breeding of other animals and how we can determine who we breed and who we bring into the world and what traits they're going to have and that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's all of that. I mean, I'm just going to say it, but you're basically all right. But the thing that really sparked it all was Darwinism, and specifically social Darwinism.
Oh, okay.
Right. So that came first, and then eugenics came out of that. But yeah, I mean, it's all the same thing, right? He was growing up at the time when social Darwinism and eugenics was all the rage. And these things really shaped his mentality to a significant degree. Now, the thing about Hayek that was very interesting was that when he first was proposing this idea of neoliberalism, it was wildly unpopular at that time because, again, the Western world had just gone through 2 major world wars and the Holocaust and the Great Depression. And, all of this had stemmed from this unregulated capitalism to a large degree, and also determinism. And, this whole thing was very unpopular at that time. And so Hayek knew that he was going to have to do something to try and sell people on the idea of neoliberalism. And what's very interesting is that he knew that in order to sell people on this new economic system, he was going to have to find a way to make it seem natural and in alignment with human nature. And he realized that there was going to have to be what is called an epistemological revolution, like a whole new worldview and philosophy that was going to have to go along with this new economic system. And now, did the neoliberals actually influence academia directly with this? Very hard to confirm an answer on that. But all of a sudden, mysteriously, this new sort of way of thinking that was very much kind of in many ways a rehash of the old way, the social Darwinist way of thinking, started coming out of the universities in the 1970s, right at the time when neoliberalism was really starting to take hold. It was a very strange combination of affairs. And Hayek himself talked about the need to kind of to ground economics in ideas about nature and human nature and animal nature and all of these things. And the other thing was that he had a group of very, very wealthy businessmen that wanted neoliberalism because, of course, it was going to profit for them. And, neoliberalism has influenced university departments in the last 4 decades greatly. So there was some speculation that they may have played a hand in that. It's not possible at this stage to verify it, but it looks like there is a significant reason to believe that they may have actually used corporate donations to get universities to promote these new sort of social Darwinist ideas at that time. The other thing I want to mention before we move on is that the Mont Pelerin Society, which is where neoliberalism was born, actually hosted an event in 2013, so not that long ago. And they held it in the Galapagos Islands. Does anyone know the significance of the Galapagos Islands?
Yeah, that's where Darwin did a lot of his studies and research, wasn't it?
Right. So they held this conference in the Galapagos Islands specifically for that reason. And they had all of these speakers from the natural sciences who were coming more from this sort of perspective that would be kind of like a new social Darwinist perspective, speaking at this event, including, does anyone know who Charles Murray is? He wrote a book called The Bell Curve.
I've heard of him. Was he the guy who was talking about IQ and the difference between certain white people and people of color?
Yeah. I mean, this is the epitome of contemporary scientific racism. And this guy had a speaking gig at a conference being held by the organization that started neoliberalism in the Galapagos Islands. So you tell me, I don't know. Can we officially say that there was an intentional connection being made there? We can't officially say it, but I think there's a large amount of incriminating evidence there that was an intentional connection being made.
Yeah, there's a big link there, isn't there, Laura, between sort of neoliberalism, capitalism, and that sense of survival of the fittest and all of that narrative that was put out there in terms of it. It's the competition. Everyone is a competitor, and so therefore, society ranks people according to their worth. Generally, it's their economic worth, and if people fall through the gaps, then tough, because that's just the way it is, and you get the undeserving poor, and you get all that kind of paradigm going on, don't you? And that it's just the way it is, and people do see the world often like that. It's like, well, people have worked really hard for what they've got. It's no surprise that they're rich. They've worked hard for it. And if you're poor and you haven't got that status or that economic worth as society sees it, then you're just you're lazy, or you just haven't worked hard enough. You haven't taken advantage of the opportunities and things like that. All of that is still out there, very prevalent, isn't it, that narrative?
Absolutely 100%. And that's out there for a reason, because the ruling class wants this imprint in our brains that that's how the world works. And it's very, very powerful. And Hayek was smart enough to realize that. Whereas I would say a lot of us, number one, in the animal liberation movement, and number two, progressives, the left, are not thinking of that. We're not realizing that really is very foundational to people's entire understanding of how the world works. So we can move on. So we can skip this one.
Can you see that? It's
yeah, this one we can skip.
Oh, yeah. We can skip this one, you say?
Yep.
Oh, sorry. Didn't catch that bit.
So, yeah, right in the 1970s, right on schedule, just as neoliberalism is coming in as the dominant economic system. Strange coincidence that the universities start pumping out this neo-Darwinian way of thinking about nature and animals and what that says about human nature, and on yet again. Enters sociobiology, behavioral ecology, evolutionary psychology. These fields really only became prominent, or this when all these books came out and all these public intellectuals went public with this, all in the 1970s, just as neoliberalism was becoming the dominant economic system. So they really worked hand in hand to convince people that neoliberalism was natural, it was in alignment with animal nature, and it was in alignment with our nature as humans. And I mean, just look at the titles here, right? We've got sociobiology, evolutionary psychology, and my favorite, the selfish gene. So this was Richard Dawkins's attempt to convince people that we are selfish by nature. All of nature is selfish by nature. And anything else, again, is just a hypocritical lie of being in denial of who and what we truly are and are meant to be. So we can continue.
We also hear all the time as an excuse for that, that this is the law of the jungle.
That's exactly it. Right. So as soon as you hear that sort of language, it's like, oh boy, dealing with a determinist here. And determinism is the underlying foundation of neoliberalism, of fascism, of Nazism, of a lot of very, very toxic ideologies.
There's really interesting chats going on in the comments, and actually there's the kind of a thread going on about Bitcoin, which is quite interesting because I think there's a whole conversation going on about whether Bitcoin and investing in Bitcoin in order to help save other animals is actually going to be a corruptive capitalist influence or not. And it's just really interesting, and I think it's quite appropriate for obviously what we're talking about.
That is incredibly interesting. I want to read those chat records after this.
Yeah. One thing that just a comment from Bernie V, which 651, Roger, just saying that, and this is kind of as part of that thread that I was just mentioning, but just saying that people have been trying to turn the tables on capitalism for a very long time, and they have failed, and capitalism has become more corrupting and degenerating. And actually, there's a quote, and I can't remember. I'm really sorry, I can't remember who actually said this, but someone said it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism.
Yeah, Mark Fisher.
And I think
that.
Is that Mark Fisher? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show how powerful these forces are in our world and in our societies and communities. So
yeah,
and I think it really speaks to what Bernie B is saying there.
So true. Yeah, and I mean, this is why this whole idea of changing this sort of template that we have in our minds is really, really important, because as long as we're stuck in either the humanist paradigm or the determinist paradigm, or obviously the dominionist paradigm, as long as we're stuck in that sort of mind frame, we are not going to be able to think in truly liberatory ways. So we can continue. So, people are like, well, what does this have to do with animals? Yeah, it has to do with animality, but what does it have to do with actual animals? Neoliberalism causes inconceivable harm to both non-human animals and their human advocates. So, little detail that I found out as I was reading about this stuff, neoliberalism is actually literally one of the key figures of the neoliberal original movement brought factory farming to the UK. So this was Ralph Harris. He was a chicken farmer. He was one of the original Mont Pelerin Society neoliberals, and he actually brought the entire concept and operation of factory farming to the United Kingdom.
Not to be confused with Rolf Harris, right?
Yeah, no, not him. These laws that we complain about, like the ag-gag laws and the criminalization of environmentalists and animal liberationists as terrorists. So I explained how neoliberalism works earlier. Can anybody think of how this connects with neoliberalism? Like the ag-gag laws are such a perfect example of this.
You mean in terms of protecting their own, as it were?
Right, they're using the government to protect the corporations, right? So it's not like the government is just saying, you guys figure it out amongst yourselves, the corporation's free to do whatever it wants to the people that try and get in its way. It's worse even than that. It's the actual government coming in and saying, listen, people, you don't have any right, trying to expose the crimes of this corporation. So it's literally the government coming in and acting on behalf of the corporations again and again at the expense of the actual people. So neoliberalism is responsible for that. Neoliberalism is responsible for, of course, deregulation. So that means they can operate the slaughter lines faster, right? More suffering for the animals, more workers getting injured, more environmental destruction, more habitat destruction. You know, when you hear all of this talk about, this massive ecological crisis that has really ramped up in the last 40 to 50 years, mass species die off in the last 40 to 50 years. Why is it the last 40 to 50 years? Because that is the period that neoliberalism has really been the dominant economic system.
That example of the slaughterhouse, Laura, is really interesting to me, because we did talk as a team on last week about there being various campaigns to get CCTV cameras into slaughterhouses, and it's a kind of interesting because that could almost be incorporated into this entire idea that things that are deregulated at the same time appear to be more regulated in terms of we've got this system which will keep all the checks and balances, but there's, as far as I can tell, there's no real way of running it or monitoring it. And as far as I know, nothing has come of it really. So it's almost been kind of just co-opted into this idea. At the same time, you could then say, well, look, we're very open and we're very, regulation.
Oh, you cut out that last part.
Yeah, just that, the suggestion is that regulation, is being strengthened through having cameras there, but really because it doesn't really mean anything, it just gets sucked into a deregulation program, really.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Is it accurate to say that without neoliberalism, the animal industrial complex wouldn't exist? I mean, obviously there would be exploitation of other animals, but this massive scale is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say that, of course, that's really capitalism, and this is just a very extreme form of capitalism. But, definitely I would say that it would exist under any form of capitalism. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, neoliberalism, it's been horrible for the planet. It's been horrible for the other species on the planet. It's been horrible for us as humans. I think there's a general consensus growing that is the case. And so the big question is, what's next? What's the big next chapter? And before we get into that, I also just want to say, anybody who understands determinism could have seen fascism on the horizon, because the original liberalism, the social Darwinism, led to fascism. Same pattern here, right? We got the sociobiology in those fields, the neo-Darwinism in a way. We've got the new unregulated capitalism, and then lo and behold, we end up with the same result. We end up with fascism. So we can continue.
We're just coming up on the hour, Laura. So do we? Can you remember how many slides we've got left?
Not many now.
Okay. Well,
I think it's only maybe like 2 or something, or 3. Yeah.
Rightio.
So here's the dilemma. If both constructing the divide between the humans and other animals and the erosion of that divide leads to atrocities being committed, then how do we solve this problem, right? I mean, it just seems like it's an impossible situation that we're in, because all roads seem to lead back to hierarchy and oppression and all these horrible things. So where does the solution lie? Well, I think it's really interesting for us to consider the work of a naturalist from 150 years ago who saw a possible solution, one which could potentially transform our understanding of both animal nature and of our own nature as animals. And that was Peter Kropotkin. So we can continue. So Peter Kropotkin was a Russian naturalist. He was a lot of other things as well, but we're going to focus on his naturalism, as well as a social scientist. And he really kind of understood that connection between those two things, that the key to framing an understanding of human nature lay in how we perceived animal nature and nature more generally. And so he lived at the time of social Darwinism. He saw how Darwin's work was being interpreted and, I would say, exploited by capitalists who had certain motives. And so he thought, I'm going to go out and I'm going to observe animals and nature myself and see what Darwin was talking about. And he went out there, and then he came back and he said, what the heck? They're all saying that it's all this, dog eat dog, nature, red, and tooth and claw, competition, survival of the fittest. And he's like, that's not what I saw at all. He said, yeah, maybe there might be a little bit of that, but that's the exception to the rule. As a general principle, what I saw was species after species after species of animals working together, cooperating, sharing, all kinds of really wonderful things. Egalitarianism, not hierarchy. And that was what was allowing them to survive. It was solidarity. It was working together as a team. Mm-hmm. And he said, so that's how things evolved. If animals were constantly fighting each other all the time, and he said they wouldn't have survived. They'd be killing each other off. He said, so he wrote this book called Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution. And he said, that's the nature of other animals. And of course, as a species of animal, that really must be our nature ultimately too. If we really wanted to live in alignment with our nature, we would live in that sort of society, not one based on competition, greed, cutthroat. It wouldn't be like, and hierarchy, it wouldn't be like that.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting, Laura, that
seems to bring up, Wendy, seems to bring up a comment that Jeremy made early on, really, which is the kind of thing about we can't have it both ways, but of course that's what humans always do. They have it both ways. Mm-hmm. Our fellow animals are either so different from us that we can breed, use, and murder them without a moral cost, or we're so similar, the same, which means that they have moral value, which of course is a kind of anti-vivisection argument, really, in terms of all that. But essentially, in a kind of complicated way, this is what's going on in this story. That sometimes they're the same if it suits. Other times they're not if it suits. Right. We kind of just have this ability to kind of chop and change in terms of what we're talking about, whether it's either other animals or ourselves, whenever it suits, depending on the circumstances, right?
Absolutely. That is exactly right. And I think that part of the reason why the left, the non-vegan left, has failed to adopt this idea is actually for that reason. Because if they did adopt this idea, it's kind of gonna beg the question, well, gee, if the other animals are so, they have all these wonderful traits and they're clearly, very conscious and, ethical beings and everything, then how can we exploit them? So,
Laura, one thing that's interesting when you're talking about Kropotkin and the way he saw the mutual aid, and actually, that wrote this book on mutual aid, is one thing Noam Chomsky says about neoliberalism is that it undermines the mechanisms of social solidarity and mutual support, and the way people will engage to help determine policies and things like that. And instead of this, you get the subordination to concentrated, unaccountable private power. And so it just really it speaks to almost, I can really see the links here in terms of, you know, the mutual aid and how that's been completely disintegrated in our societies through neoliberalism and forces like that we're subject to.
And also,
Exactly.
would you say that the fact that he was an anarchist, that the fact that he had these specific political beliefs, and obviously was not a fan of hierarchies, it allowed him to see mutual aid and solidarity in nature?
Yeah, I'm going to address actually both of those comments. So, Nella first. Absolutely, yes. But, you know, it's interesting because he was criticized a lot for that, because a lot of people who came after him said, well, you're just some anarchist crank, you know, he saw what he wanted to see in nature and he just projected that onto it. And he was really discredited for that reason for a long time. And what's really interesting is that just recently now, a lot of scientists in these fields are saying, you know what, Kropotkin was right. And they're not anarchists. They're just scientists who are looking at the reality as it really is. And they're saying, wow, he was right. All along he was right. So, and Wendy, so about Noam Chomsky, very interesting, because I actually didn't realize this until I was specifically doing the research for this project. And I found out that he has actually advocated for a socio-biological framework for understanding how human society is supposed to be organized, or how, you know, what is human nature. And at first I was like, oh my God, you know, because you're sociobiology and you think, you know, like the selfish gene and all this all horrible stuff. But actually, this is what he was talking about. He was the rare leftist who was saying, you know what, we really should be taking a look at Kropotkin's framing of this again today. And I obviously agree with him.
Yeah, here we've got the issue of religion being part of the story as well, which is interesting. I don't know if you wanted to have a quick look at that, but I mean, obviously the issue of you know, morality in other animals and culture in other animals is very controversial, because it's one of the things that we want to really kind of guard just for ourselves, isn't it? You know, don't want to give any of that away, kind of thing.
Yeah, and I mean, again, that's like the bias then. But I think that the evidence is becoming more and more trending in that direction, that they do have those things. That's amazing about Japan. I really would actually like to read more about that. So for the listeners, the message was that they discovered that other animals had culture and morality in Japan in like the 1950s. So we can continue. So yeah, in the ensuing century, science is proving that Kropotkin was right on many levels, actually way beyond Kropotkin's wildest dreams. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of some experimental research that was done recently, where they discovered other animals acting in ways that I would say could really only be classified as moral. One was a study that was done with rats, and in this study they had a rat who was in a cage, and then another rat who was roaming free. And there was some food put out for the rat who was roaming free, and they said 9 times out of 10, the rat that was roaming free rejected the food, went and freed their friend, and then shared the food, but they would not eat without their friend. So that was one study. And another study that I thought was really interesting was with gibbons. And in this study, they gave the gibbons, 2 different gibbons. One of them, they gave cucumbers, which is a less desirable food. And the other gibbon, they gave grapes. And they said that the gibbon who was getting the cucumber would protest, because they knew that it wasn't fair, that they should get the crappy food and their friend that should get the better food. And so they would refuse to eat unless they got grapes too. And then actually the researchers were kind of criticized for calling that moral behavior, because people said, Well, that's just them acting in their own self-interest again, right? That's the selfish gene. So they did the study with chimpanzees. Here's where it gets even more interesting, because some of the chimpanzees that were getting the grapes, so the better food this time, they protested. And they said, we will not accept grapes until our friend is also getting grapes, right? Which means they understood a concept that a lot of humans don't seem to understand and that we talk about a lot these days, which is called privilege. So the chimps understood the whole concept of privilege and inequality, and that they could use their privileged position to protest, to reject that privilege in solidarity with their friends who didn't have the privilege until there was equality. So, I mean, astonishing levels of understanding about how this works, about mutual aid, about solidarity.
We have a lot to learn,
humans,
don't we? We have a lot to learn from other animals, actually.
We really have a lot to learn from them. Yeah.
Do you know what's really interesting? When you hear about these studies, and I don't know if you folks find this as well, but I spend a lot of time listening to these kind of books or reading about studies that have been done and the science that's there in order to kind of know the theory and back up your arguments. And yet it always leaves me with big knots in my stomach, because a lot of the time you're hearing information that's been discovered through research, through experiments on other animals or testing and things like this. And it's so, you get that double-edged sword in a way that you think, right, this is great information. I'm really glad we've got this data. However, the fact that it was even done in the first place is quite against all my values. In the, it's
I know. I think about that all the time, obviously.
Yeah. A great book about other animals' morality that states many such examples is Mark Bickoff's Wild Justice.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Yep, I was actually going to recommend Mark Bickoff as someone that people should read, and Franz de Waal as well. I saw just came up in the chat. These are definitely the researchers that people should definitely read if they want to know more about this.
And Deb asked you if you'd read this one, Laura.
I have not. I really need to read that one. Wow. Created from Animals, The Moral Implications of Darwinism by James Rachels. That is going on my wish list. So we
I can't believe we found a book you haven't read, Laura. Wow.
He'd be surprised. I've got quite a stack. But thank you. Okay, so we can move on to the next one. And not just on the intraspecies level, but on the interspecies level as well. Now, Kirkpakis was only looking on the intraspecies level, communities of animals in the same species. But in the century since, I mean, his mind would explode with what has been discovered about this, because more and more what scientists have realized is that we live in a world where all species are dependent on each other. This is where the whole idea of the Gaia complex came from, this idea of symbiosis, all interdependency. And, you know, of course, there are many, many different levels and layers of that I could speak about. There's definitely a growing sense of awareness that even one species going extinct, and obviously we're living in the era of mass extinction. So this era of mass extinction is really leading to the threat of our own extinction, because nature is so interdependent that you wipe out one species, it affects every single other species. So there's a much, much greater understanding of that now. And I also want to mention a very important discovery that just blew my mind. Just doing the research for this project, there's an article on Salon.com that just came out recently about the selfish gene, saying we need to get rid of that concept. It's time to throw it in the bin, as they say. And what they've discovered is that not only are we interdependent in terms of one species being dependent on all the rest, of course, plants being dependent on animals, animals being dependent on plants, and all the rest of it. But symbiosis even goes further than that in other ways. Like, for example, the whole idea of epigenetics, which is a new field of science, tells us that there's no such thing as a selfish gene, because actually our genes are responsive to our experiences, and how they form or don't form is dependent on that. So there's even interdependency there between our external circumstances and who we are on the genetic level. So, I mean, there's just like layers and layers of interdependency and this concept of diversity, biodiversity. And I want to say one other thing before we move on from this, which is that when you think about it in terms of interdependency and that thriving individual requires a thriving biodiverse system, an ecosystem, right, of all different species and all different kinds of plants and animals and etc. This really disrupts this sort of fascist determinist ideology in a lot of ways, including the idea, the old determinist idea of there's maybe strength and solidarity within our own kind. But if there's a foreign element that comes in, that threatens our health and well-being. But when you realize that everything is interdependent, then you realize, oh, the different elements actually enhance our well-being and we enhance theirs. And we're dependent on diversity for that reason. Diversity of all kinds. So that's basically it. And the last thing I'm going to say is that this is something that I think is a really important time to be thinking about this, because there's definitely, number one, a growing consensus that neoliberalism is on its way down, or at least that people are really looking for a new system. So it is a great time to be talking to people about a new way of thinking about these things, a new way of understanding ourselves and our relationship to other animals and what other animals tell us about ourselves. And this is really like a prime time to be doing this. And obviously we've got the climate crisis and everything else, but it's really a time that we can kind of shape a new way of thinking. And this opens up possibilities for liberation of other animals, for liberation of ourselves as humans, obviously for the health of the planet. So, I mean, it's really a very profound time to be making these sorts of connections and realizing how these things inform our understanding of the world and our actions in it. And one last thing I want to say before that, let's not let the right continue to have control of that narrative, because the animal rights movement can play a very, very powerful, important role in shaping a liberatory way of thinking rather than a reactionary way of thinking.
Yeah, as long as the right don't have control of that as well. Just in terms of that genetics point that you mentioned, Laura, it was epigenetics, right? EPI.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And that's it.
So.
Wow, a lot to take in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, these were some follow-up questions that I posed. I don't know if we have time. It's not necessary if we don't.
Well, it's 20. It's coming up to 20 past. But,
I think we're fine. We can just end here. It's fine.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, I shall stop.
It seems that seems like the important message from everything you said there, Laura, in that it's actually the important thing. It's we need to make fundamental changes in how we see ourselves and the world and other animals, most importantly, in order to start changing the paradigms, the ideologies that we live by. If we don't change those, then we're stuck, really, aren't we? And I think that one of the biggest things I think we ought to be changing is that idea and that concept of dominion, because I think that is probably one of the most disastrous ideas that humans ever had, that we are here to dominate and control. because I think that runs through a lot of the thread of what you've been talking about, is that hierarchy, the supremacy, the dominion and control, and it obviously creates everything we're fighting against. It kind of feeds that monster.
That is 100% right. I agree 1,000,000%. And I have to say that one of the reasons that I really was drawn to look into this subject matter is because I think a lot of animal rights activists very much see that in terms of the problem being the human-animal divide, right? And I agree that that is a really big problem. But at the same time, I was noticing that, especially in the animal rights movement, I would hear people speaking in ways that seemed to remove that divide, but yet they were still so incredibly oppressive. And I was like, what the heck is going on here? This is like very weird and disturbing. They're using some kind of like weird logic. I don't really understand it. And what I realized was that, they seem to be removing the divide, but they're not removing the idea of the hierarchy. They're just seeing it as a hierarchy of species. But they're not removing that. They're not changing their view of what is animal nature. That's another big part of it. And then, of course, what that says about human nature. They're not taking away those things. They're keeping those things in place. And so if you remove that boundary, but you keep those things in place, that's how you end up with the determinist ideology and eco-fascism and social Darwinism and all the rest of it.
Just looking at the comments. Yeah, I was just looking at that one.
Jeremy, but I'm not quite sure.
I guess you might mean protection,
that would seem to suggest welfare, wouldn't it?
I would say, though, that, I do think that suggests welfarism, because that's still thinking that we're the ones who protect them and not that they protect us, which they do a lot.
Well,
So,
could you say protecting humans from causing harm in that sense?
Protecting humans in many, many ways. We just don't realize it.
Mm.
It's kind of all invisibilized. We're not seeing it, but other animals are taking actions all the time that protect us in many, many, many ways.
Right. Laura, you must have a sense of fulfillment.
I'm sure you're all like, oh my God. Did we really come to the end?
This is really great series.
It's been a great
It's like getting to the end of Breaking Bad or all that kind of thing. What do we do now? What do we do now?
Thank you. I'm glad you see it.
There's like an emptiness now. There's an emptiness.
A void.
Yeah.
We've created a Laura void.
You can always have me come on and talk about other subjects, like natter on about it.
in terms of those last 6 sessions that you did, Laura, can you say all that again, please? Just so we've all
Just summarize.
I kind of tried to do that in this session.
No, you
the
did.
entire history of the world from the Neolithic era onward. In fact, pre-Neolithic era.
And here comes the star of the show.
Laura, I have a final question. If people want to get in touch with the Panellist organization, how they can find you?
So they can just find me on Facebook. That's probably an easy way. So just look me up on Facebook, Laura Schleifer. I'm right there under my name. Or they can look up Plant the Land Team on Facebook as well. We have a Facebook page. We do have a website. The URL's a little bit complicated because I'm still building the website. So it's probably easier to just go through Facebook and either look up my name or Plant the Land Team. We have an Instagram as well, also under Plant the Land Team, Twitter as well under Plant the Land Team. So you can reach us any of those ways.
Great.
I love Dave's comment that they've just written, animal rights people will become like the Jedi, guardians of peace and justice. love that, Dave. I really love that. I can imagine us all, dressed in Jedi suits.
Get our lightsabers ready.
Lightsabers at the ready. Brian, I feel asleep. He's covered me in his hair because he's wearing his really. I'm literally got hair all over my face where he's wafting his.
Well, we notice now, Wendy, that when we used to kind of try and do strictly kind of, I know we never really did it, but we tried to do strictly 60 minutes, and then Brian was in and out of the shows, and then when we got a bit longer and longer, it always turns up at the ends. It's kind of like, right, we're getting near my dinner time now. So.
Yeah,
It's almost like an alarm clock, isn't he? Really?
Yeah.
Oh, totally. Yeah, his body clock is on it.
Right. So, on behalf of everybody, I'm sure, Laura, we'd like to thank you so much for all the work you've done and all the research you've done, and. Obviously, the videos will be up there for posterity, and we might be able to figure out a way of kind of linking them together in some way. Might certainly be able to put them into a playlist, on my channel. That might be quite a good way of grouping them together, that kind of thing. So hopefully we might do that.
That would be really, really great. Yeah.
We got a bye from Bernie. So bye, Bernie. And
bye, Bernie.
Thank you,
everyone
Bernie.
else.
Bye, everyone. And thank
bye,
you, Laura. I echo what Roger said. Thank you so much for all your hard work.
Thank you so much. Thank you for letting me have so much airtime to go through the entire history of the world.
It was our pleasure.
The history of the world in 4 sessions.
Yeah.
Don't worry, Laura. The invoice is in the post. So, so goodbye, everyone. And
bye, everyone.
Way and talk over it, no doubt.